Okay, Unit 4, Road to Revolution, Chapter 10, Steps Toward Independence, Lesson 3, the Convention of 1836. We will learn that following the capture of San Antonio, Texans moved toward independence and formed a new government. Terms to know: allocate, to give to or assign to; sole, only; ad interim, a Latin term meaning for the time between; petition, a formal written request to a government to take some action or change a policy; community property, property obtained during the course of the marriage. Here's some photos. I'll go through these quickly. There's a comparison chart here of the Texas and the U.S. constitutions. You can study that in your slides. People of Texas in the 1830s. As an independent republic, Texas granted voting and property rights to men, the same rights they had enjoyed under the Constitution of Coahuila in Texas in 1827. The new Constitution recognized women's right to community property, but women had no voting rights in Texas until 1919. The Mexican Constitution of 1824 prohibited slavery. Any enslaved people that went to Mexico at that time were freed. This provision was not enforced in Texas, however, and the new Republic of Texas retained slavery. Slavery did not end in Texas until 1865. Tejanos had the same rights as Anglos under the new Constitution of the Republic of Texas. Tejano women, of course, had the same limited rights as Anglo women. The Cherokee and other Native American groups lived in various parts of Texas. The Constitution did not recognize them as citizens. They were, in effect, outside the laws set by the Texas government. Starting a new republic. Guiding question: how did the views of Texans toward independence change in early 1836? By February 1836, Santa Anna and his army were in San Antonio. Meanwhile, 59 delegates arrived at Washington on the Brazos for the Convention of 1836. This was the fourth convention in which Texans met to decide whether Texas should remain part of Mexico. With Santa Anna's army in Texas, the delegates knew they had to act fast. All settlements in Texas were represented. Battle sites were especially well represented. San Antonio de Bejar was allocated 4 delegates, and Gonzales and Goliad each had 2. The first task of the convention was to elect a chairman. The delegates chose Richard Ellis. H.S. Kimball was chosen as secretary. The next step was to appoint a committee to write a Declaration of Independence. George Childress was named chairman of the committee. Historians generally agree that he was the Declaration's sole or only author. On March 2nd, the committee presented the Declaration of Independence and all the delegates approved it. March 2nd became Texas Independence Day. The convention then turned to writing a constitution for the new republic. A republic is a form of government in which citizens elect representatives to make laws for them. On March 16th, the Texas Constitution was completed and approved. The delegates then formed an ad interim or temporary government. They elected Sam Houston as commander-in-chief of the Texas military. The convention made other decisions too. It passed a resolution requiring all males ages 17 to 50 to serve in the Army. The delegates also offered land grants of 1,280 acres to volunteers who stayed for the entire war. They did all this work in only 2 weeks. While they were creating the new government, General Santa Anna was invading San Antonio. Models for a new government. Guiding question: how did Texas's diverse background influence its Declaration of Independence and Constitution? The Texas delegates used documents they knew as models for the Texas Declaration and Constitution. They primarily looked to the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. The delegates also included some rights they had enjoyed under Spanish and Mexican rule. The introduction to the Declaration lists complaints against the British king to justify the American Revolution. The Texas Declaration has a similar introduction. It states that Santa Anna violated the liberties guaranteed by the Mexican Constitution of 1824. The convention charged that Texans had lost many rights, including freedom of religion and the right to trial by jury, the right to bear arms, and the right to petition the government. A petition is a formal written request to a government to take some action. Finally, because Mexico had sent an army, the Texas Declaration notes that the protests were met with military force. There are also similarities between the Constitution of Texas and that of the United States. The similarities are 3 branches of government: the executive, legislative and judicial, and a Bill of Rights protecting freedoms of speech, the press, and religion, right to trial by jury, and other basic civil rights. Some provisions were unique to Texas at the time. For example, the document said that both husbands and wives could own community property. This is property gained during marriage. Women did not have this right in most states. The Constitution also had protections for people in debt. The Constitution had clear rules about property ownership, too. Ministers and priests could not hold public office. This was based on the principle of the separation of church and state. However, the Convention of 1836 did not view all people equally. For example, the Constitution made slavery legal, and people moving into Texas could bring enslaved people. Enslaved people had no rights. Also, free African Americans were not allowed to live in the Republic of Texas without the permission of the legislature. Their rights to own land were restricted. Native American rights were also left out of the Constitution. In 1835, Sam Houston had adopted Cherokee, began talks about a treaty with the Cherokee. The treaty was finalized in February of 1836, and it granted the Cherokee the rights to their land. It never took effect, however, because the convention did not approve it. The war's influence. Guiding question. How did Mexico's invasion of Texas affect the formation of the new government? Because Santa Anna was moving quickly, there was no time to hold elections to approve the Constitution or elect new leaders. The convention selected officers for another ad interim government who would serve until regular elections could be held. The new leaders included the first president, David G. Burnett. Sam Houston was elected unanimously as commander of all Texas forces, including the volunteers and regular army, and Houston left the convention on March 6th to take command of the army at Gonzales. He arrived there on March 11th. The Alamo had already fallen, and its defenders were dead. Houston prepared to battle Santa Anna. On March 15th, reports reached the convention that the Alamo had fallen. 2 days later, on March 17th, the delegates received word that Santa Anna's army is marching toward Washington on the Brazos. The convention ended and the members scattered. President Burnett and his cabinet headed southeast. They established a government at Harrisburg, which is today part of Houston. A few weeks later, as Santa Anna's army approached them there, the government again was forced to flee, this time to Galveston. The war was underway, and the future looked bleak for the new Republic of Texas.